If you're like me and you want to know how to do something, you Google it, or you go to YouTube. When I was invited to give this talk, I looked for videos on YouTube that would explain how to give a good talk. And the first thing they said was, whatever you do, don't start your talk by thanking everybody. If you do, your audience will switch off and you'll never regain their attention. I thought about this a lot, actually. But slowly it dawned on me that the topic of my talk today is courtesy. And I thought, well, I'm going to have to give YouTube a miss this time. So I'd like to thank the selection committee for placing their faith in me. I'd like to thank the Dean for accepting the recommendation. He could easily have denied it. He has that authority. I'd like to thank Shasta, who is the embodiment of efficiency and who prepared a lot of the work behind the scenes. Kina, thank you for coming and for giving that prayer. Kina is one of my oldest friends here in Provo and a wonderful colleague. She's always been supportive of me over the last 20 years. Jeff, what can I say? You've heard Jeff's command of language. It's unparalleled. Things have to go down from here on, Jeff. So I'm not thanking you for that introduction. My colleagues in Spanish are wonderful. I'm used to living in an academic scholarly community where one-upmanship was everything. You got a lunch with a colleague and he had to be wittier than you, say better quips than you. We don't have that in our department. Our colleagues are supportive. They genuinely rejoice, I think, when one of their members succeeds in an area, and that's highly, highly unusual. And that is really one of the bonuses of being at BYU. And of course the students, who are also wonderful. I'd like to thank the Barker family for their consistent support of the Humanities and for sponsoring this activity that brings us all together. It's brought my family here, it's brought friends back like Keenan and Jerry and others, and it's wonderful to see you. And I'd also like to thank all those of you, there's London. Hi, London. Another one of my oldest friends, and the person I go to when I have doubts about whether something is possible in Spanish or not. I'd like to thank all the attendees as well, all of you who are here, for giving up an hour of your time that you will never recover. It's gone forever. But thank you all, I appreciate it. I better put my glasses on, I can't see. Well, I began scholarly life as a sociolinguist, as Jeff said. When I got my first job 43 years ago, I was assigned to teach history of the Spanish language. This proved challenging, I have to confess, and somewhat dry, because in those days, there was, in my view, scant interest in the external history of the language. Now, not everybody would agree with that. I remember Roger Wright, a British scholar, castigating Rafael Lapesa for writing a history of the language that was focused too much on external history. But for me, it's still not enough. The focus in those days was on how the morphology and phonology of Latin had morphed into those of Spanish. And that was something that needs to be taught, but something that I thought could be added to. And there was even less interest in the implication of language and society. Sociolinguistics was still in its infancy in those days, and it certainly hadn't begun to address or use sociolinguistic techniques to study the history of language. I think Suzanne Romain at Edinburgh was one of the first people to apply those techniques to English. Fortunately, things are changing. Now, for me, this lack of interest, or relative lack of interest, was unfortunate, as Spanish has a fascinating history that invites serious and satisfying consideration of such matters. One area in which I tried to combine external history and the connection between language and society is that of forms of address in palace and diplomatic circles. Now, it's sometimes supposed that the way we interact with our interlocutor under normal circumstances is mostly a question of language, Spanish in this case, that requires, among other things, correct use of informal and formal pronouns. But if we stop to think about it, we soon realize that the way we use language to address others is usually accompanied by a host of other adjustments in our behavior. In fact, the Spanish equivalent of forms of address is tratamiento, a word that translates literally as treatment and suggests that when we interact with others, there's much more involved than simply the words we choose to use. Our colleagues who teach, say, Japanese will surely be acutely aware of this. Albeit a touch extreme, let me give you an example from 17th century Spain. This is the case of Don Juan José de Austria, the illegitimate son of King Philip IV. The fact that Don Juan was illegitimate meant that despite having a king as his father, he was not a prince. So it wasn't always easy for him to know how he should interact with others. His status in society was problematic. Problematic cases were, of course, not that rare at this time, and explain why in the palace of the Spanish king there existed a junta de etiquetas, a committee charged with determining the protocols that best fitted a difficult or anomalous situation. In the case of Don Juan, the committee's advice was as follows. He was to address a cardinal, a prince of the church, as Eminencia Reverendissima, receive him in the center of his antechamber, replace his hat at the same time as the cardinal, invite the cardinal to pass through doorways first, but pass through first himself after the invitation had been declined. Provide the cardinal with a seat on the dais identical to his own, allow him to sit to his left and facing forward when traveling in Don Juan's coach, and take his leave of the cardinal at the top of the staircase. Next come the grandees. The rank of grandee was the highest among the nobility of Spain, and usually hereditary. It was roughly equivalent to that of peer of the realm in the UK and pair in France. Whether male or female, grandees were to be treated slightly less deferentially than cardinals. Don Juan was to receive and take his leave of a grandee at the doorway of his chamber, remove his hat to waist level, provide the grandee with a seat identical to his own, allow him to sit in his coach but not facing forward, facing the rear, and address him as Señoría. If the visitor was an archbishop, other than the Archbishop of Toledo, the primate of Spain, or a member of the Council of State, Don Juan was to receive and take his leave of him in the center of his chamber, remove his hat with a less obvious flourish, whatever that means, provide his visitor with a leather seat, which was different from his own, which would be of cloth or velvet, address him as Señoría, but deny access to his coach. In the case of titled gentlemen and bishops, Don Juan was to remove himself 2 paces from the table where he left his hat, so that it would be out of reach. He was to invite his visitor to replace his hat, but since Don Juan remained uncovered, the visitor would likewise remain uncovered. Finally, he was to address his visitor as Merced, unless the latter happened to be one of Don Juan's personal servants and should be addressed as vos. Now this list, which underscores the fact that forms of address are just one aspect of behavior that is adjusted according to the status of one's interlocutor, continues with small but significant variations at each point in the social hierarchy. From it, we learn the importance of reputation and of one's place in 17th century European society. In fact, so important were they that laws were passed to ensure that people behaved correctly. For example, in July 1600, King Philip III issued a pragmatic sanction relating to the extension of courtesies that states, "Those who disregard what is stipulated and commanded, whether male or female, will incur the following penalty. For the first offence, a fine of 200 ducats. For the second, a fine of 400 ducats. And for the third, a fine of 1,000 ducats, as well as banishment for 1 year that prohibits the individual from coming within 5 leagues of the court or towns and cities of the kingdom where the offence occurred. The penalty will be applied to those who extend the incorrect courtesy, to those who receive it fully, and to those who witness the offence without informing the authorities. Witnesses, as well as the person who reports the abuse, may issue their statements in secret." The language employed here is clear and direct. It paints a society that is highly stratified, and more importantly, one that is resolved to preserve the requisite distance between its members by imposing heavy penalties, not just on the giver and receiver of inappropriate forms of address or other courtesies, but also on anyone who might idly look on while such violations of the law occurred. Someone like John Cleese would surely have great fun basing a skit in this seemingly absurd situation. The trial procedures governing the treatment of witnesses and accusers are redolent in their secrecy of those adopted by the Inquisition, while the penalty reserved for the recalcitrant offender is nothing short of draconian. Banishment from court and the royal presence was a serious measure, Monarchs resorted to it for a variety of reasons, including the punishment of ambassadors deemed not to have discharged properly their duties abroad. Its impact on the individual concerned would have been profound. At the very least, exclusion from court affected the psychological well-being of the accused and damaged his reputation. Furthermore, 1,000 ducats was a huge sum of money, roughly equivalent in the early 1600s to 2.5 years' salary of a Spanish embassy secretary stationed in London or Paris. And punishment was heaped not just upon those who extended a courtesy that was less than required, but also upon those who accorded a distinction that their interlocutor standing in society clearly did not merit. In other words, the law sought to protect individuals against those who might deliberately set out to offend, as well as against those who resorted to flattery with some base motive in mind. The aim then was to reduce, insofar as possible, the scope of psychopragmatic factors when treating one's neighbour. Such strict regulation of the way in which individuals addressed and treated each other implies an obsession that is difficult for speakers of modern English to comprehend. However, this obsession was by no means uniquely Spanish in the 17th century. It was universal in Europe, especially at the highest levels of society. For this reason, diplomatic exchanges between European governments and communications between prominent nobles needed to be conducted with the utmost sensitivity, as we will see later. Not unrelated to this kind of pragmatic sanction, and the privileges reflecting the status of an interlocutor, are the sumptuary laws governing, for example, the entitlement to wear certain items of clothing. In fact, Mulhouse and Harry attribute the expansion of polite you at the expense of informal or thou in English, partly to the unwillingness of the wider English population to heed such laws. This is what they say. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the sumptuary laws, assigning particular styles of clothing to the various ranks and classes of society, were widely flouted. It was difficult to identify the social status or rank of a stranger from their appearance. Better to play safe and use the polite you. Similar abuses plagued Spanish society during the reign of Charles II and probably earlier. Briefly then, a person might extend a form of address that was better than the address he was entitled to, not just for psychopragmatic reasons like flattery, but also when appearances suggested that the latter's standing in society was higher than it really was. Furthermore, such abuses could only debase the value of the forms of address used, and quite probably lead individuals who possessed the correct rank to demand an even more statesful honorific. I don't have time to provide details today, but I am confident that this is partly the reason why counts and marquesses, who were addressed as merced in the 16th century, demanded in the 17th century to be addressed as señoría. In other words, by the 17th century, there was no longer anything particularly special about the honorific merced. Counts and marquesses, who unquestionably felt they were special, demanded that their social standing be reflected in the way they were addressed. Consequently, a pragmatic sanction was issued in 1611, again by Philip III, stipulating that henceforth it would be permissible to address counts and marquesses as señoría, a title significantly more prestigious than merced, which, when combined with vuestra, is, as you may know, the origin of modern Spanish usted. Now, some of you will have noticed that this pragmatic sanction is in direct conflict with that of 1600. Whereas that of 1600 is designed to close the door to psychopragmatic factors, this pragmatic sanction opens the door to psychopragmatic factors. Let's turn now to some specific cases. Charles II of Great Britain and Ireland. How to address a king without a kingdom. You all know the background to what I'm about to discuss. Charles I was executed in 1649 by Oliver Cromwell, who established an English Commonwealth. 7 years later, Philip IV of Spain struck a treaty with a man who in time would become Charles II of Great Britain and Ireland, but who for now was excluded from the throne and forced to live in exile. This treaty included a promise of Spanish assistance for Charles to succeed to the throne to which he was entitled, in exchange for the services of Charles's troops against France and help against Portugal after the British King's restoration. Under its terms, Charles was to receive what turned out to be an irregularly paid pension, and he and his brother, the Duke of York, were allowed to reside in the Low Countries following their exclusion from France. However, long before Charles arrived in Brussels, Archduke Leopold of Austria, Governor-General of Flanders, had written to Madrid, expressing concern over how to address a king without a kingdom. In his letter, Leopold noted that he'd had no difficulty addressing Charles as an equal when the latter was Prince of Wales, but now he was unsure of Charles's precise status. With an eye on reactions elsewhere in Europe, he reported the following. I have not wanted to be the first to resolve the treatment of this prince, who, contrary to law and reason, has been robbed of his kingdoms and estates, having heard that the Dutch have dispatched emissaries to him to express their condolences, that they addressed him as sire in French, and on one occasion as majesty, which they mispronounced, and that they were unwilling to extend to him in writing the courtesy they'd given him orally. The Archduke's concerns were considered by Spain's Council of State on the 29th of March. The 4 members of the Council present on that occasion were keenly aware that all of Europe was waiting to see how princes in rival European courts would address Charles. Therefore, they came up with an ingenious recommendation to the king. Leopold should address Charles as Majesty with all his titles. However, his letter to Charles should be backdated so that it seemed to have been written before news of Charles's exclusion from the throne had reached Brussels. In this way, Leopold might satisfy Charles without giving offence to Cromwell and the English Parliament. Now, these 2 things may be gleaned from the Archduke's exchange with Madrid. First, reputation is all important. Nobody wants to be the first to try to resolve the intractable question of Charles's titles and be seen to get it wrong. They cannot afford to offend Charles, after all, he might be restored to the throne, or Cromwell, nor do they wish to look silly. The Archduke evidently considered the matter of Charles's titles to be so crucial that he referred it to Madrid. And as we've just read, he gently mocks the Dutch for the way in which they've handled things. Spain, on the other hand, rather shrewdly avoids having to find a solution, simply by putting an incorrect date on the letter. And second, unsurprisingly, people are much more cautious about what they put in writing than what they do when they speak. What we write has a certain permanence and may well be made public. What we speak in private, unless recorded, quickly evaporates and may easily be denied. The Dutch position then would seem perfectly reasonable. The importance of epistolary etiquette is further illustrated in an exchange between the Duke of Orleans and Philip IV of Spain. The Duke had written to Philip in French with a request that the Duke of Guise, who at the time was a prisoner in Spain, be swapped for several Spanish prisoners held in France. In its meeting on the 7th of August 1651, the Council of State focused significantly not on the Duke's request, but on his lack of attention to protocol. It objected particularly to the fact that the Duke had addressed Philip as Monsieur, and recommended that the king respond accordingly. Now, the Duke's mistake, if we feel inclined to be charitable, is forgivable. Monarchs were correctly addressed as sire or sire, not monsieur. Monsieur being used in France to address not the king, but his eldest living brother. Nevertheless, since the established honorific extended to the Spanish monarch in Spanish was señor, and since monsieur in other contexts adequately translates señor, and incidentally has a root that is cognate with señor and with sire, we may conclude that the Duke intended no offence. After all, he sought the favour of the Spanish king. So perhaps we may give him the benefit of the doubt that the Spanish Council of State declined to give and suppose that he merely messed up. It may be that he also messed up by writing in French rather than in Latin, something that is not specifically discussed by the Council of State. But whatever we conclude, the Duke was understood in Madrid to have breached protocol quite seriously. And this prompts the order issued later in the month outlining how Philip's reply to Orleans should be couched. According to this order, Philip's letter should be drafted in Spanish with a margin equal to the width of 2 fingers. On the envelope, to be sealed with thread, should be written, Al Serenissimo Señor Gaston de Bourbon, Duca de Orleans, mi hermano, to the most serene Gaston de Bourbon, Duke of Orleans, my brother. If we compare the protocol used here with that of a letter written by Philip to the Duke in 1642, we find some significant differences. In 1642, the instructions were as follows. Now, the French is up there. It's taken from a Spanish manuscript. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it. I would hate to destroy the French language in front of my colleagues from French, so I'll read just the English translation. So the letter is to be written in French. The first line to begin, my good sir and brother. Formal address, Highness. Closure of the letter. Meanwhile, my good brother, we ask God to grant your Highness perfect health for many years to come. Above the signature, your good brother, and on the outside of the letter, to my good brother, the Duke of Orleans. The first thing to note about the 1651 letter is the choice of language, which is Spanish, not French. The second is that the honorific Highness is omitted. And the third is that the council is so exercised by the offence that it ignores, at least on this occasion, the Duke's request to exchange prisoners with Spain. Clearly, Madrid felt that the Duke's breach of protocol warranted a response that unambiguously signalled the displeasure of the Spanish king, and nobody wanted to incur the displeasure of the Spanish king. Now, we may well ask ourselves at this point how far things might be taken in matters of tratamiento. Let's move to the 1660s and look at the case of the Duke of Montalto. Montalto served the Spanish crown in a variety of ways. In the 1660s, he was appointed Mayordomo Mayor, Lord High Steward of the Queen's household. Members of the household henceforward became his subjects, not merely his subordinates. He was therefore entitled to address them as vos, just as the king addressed his subjects as vos. Following the death of Philip IV in 1665, the Spanish throne passed to a very young and sickly Charles II. At that time, Charles's household was much reduced and notably lacked a Lord High Steward, this function being discharged by the sommelier de corps or groom of the stole. However, it wasn't long before, in addition to serving as Lord High Steward of the Queen's household, Montalto was appointed acting Lord High Steward of the new King's household. As acting Lord High Steward, he was, of course, not entitled to address the members of the household as vos, because strictly speaking, they were not his subjects. Now, Montalto was uncommonly touchy about matters of courtesy and so quickly appreciated the problem. It's worth noting that he'd already been in discussion with the late king about how to address members of the Queen's household, alleging that he had no idea how he, as a new Lord High Steward, should address the various functionaries under him, since there was no clear precedent on which to rely. It seems that previous Lord High Stewards had not all followed the same protocol. Given the confusion surrounding the issue and its importance, Montalto asks the king for a speedy solution to his dilemma, stating that it is almost impossible to have dealings with the officials of the Queen's household in the absence of approved procedures for addressing them. In fact, the Duke does everything in his power to avoid interacting with these officials, with the result that the business of the household almost grinds to a halt, except for the susceptibilities of the time. The king responded to Montalto within a month. My colleagues in Spanish will surely be familiar with the saying, las cosas van despacio. Palace business moves slowly. Everything in the palace moves slowly. I'm afraid I lost the rhyme there with the translation, but that's roughly what it means. And my colleagues will likely agree that for Philip to respond to the Duke within a month was prompt action indeed. This was Spain, after all. And kings had a lot on their mind. In 1663, for example, the year of this exchange, Spain was still embroiled in a protracted war with Portugal. So the promptness with which the king gets back to Montalto suggests that the matter that is causing the Duke to lose sleep is in no way trivial. This conclusion is further supported by the fact that the king provides Montalto with guidance he should follow only until such time as the relevant committee is able to meet and prescribe the best course of action. In other words, resolution of the matter cannot wait. Montalto must be given some guidance quickly so that he could get on with his work. Accordingly, he's instructed to address all officials in the household as vos. Members of the Queen's household are, after all, his subjects, and subjects, as mentioned, may correctly be addressed as vos. Nevertheless, when addressing the higher officials, Montalto should combine vos with señor, which is a solution that will allow him to respect the social distance separating lower and higher household officials. Put another way, the addition of señor serves as a kind of softener, one that lessens the impact, in the case of the higher officials, of being addressed as vos, which for the most part sat rather low in the hierarchy of honorifics. In 1666, when he's appointed acting Lord High Steward of young King Charles's household, Montalto expresses to the Queen Regent concerns similar to those he'd expressed some years earlier to King Philip. In fact, the exchange of notes between them develops into quite a wrangle, with the Duke all but refusing to accept the decision of the Queen, who insists that members of the King's household are not Montalto's subjects, and therefore should not be addressed as vos, but as Merefid. For Montalto, such a solution is unworkable. He proposes an alternative, but no surprise, it's rejected. Now, that the whole situation is anomalous is self-evident, as is the fact that Montalto must eventually bow to the wishes of the Queen. Nevertheless, the Duke is prepared to argue with his sovereign over this matter in a series of exchanges, quite a long series of exchanges. and that he did his best on an earlier occasion to avoid interacting with members of the Queen's household because he was unsure of the correct protocol, tells us much about Montalto's personality. It also underlines the significance of tratamiento. Coincidentally, we learn too from this exchange that according to the Queen, merced may indeed be used to address the inferior. Well, we've said some things about the 17th century. What about today? This complex system of honorifics and courtesies, which applies just as much to institutions as it does to individuals, is still very much alive today. Here are a few examples from Spain and the UK, both of which continue to be monarchies and retain a clear pyramidal social structure. So let's get Spain first, take Spain first. How would you address the City Council of Provo? How does the most excellent City Council of Provo sound to you? Well, this is precisely what they do in Spain. El excelentísimo Ayuntamiento de Valladolid, the most excellent City Council of Valladolid. Excelentísimo, most excellent, is also the honorific used to address the mayor of the city. We have El Ilustre Colegio de Abogados in Madrid, the illustrious College of Barristers in Madrid. Members of the Spanish Parliament address each other as Señoría, and so on. All this, it must be said, seems to jar with the current trend in Spain, where my impression is that tú is becoming increasingly acceptable in contexts where not so long ago one would have expected usted. The same thing appears to be happening in the plural, where vosotros, according to Scott Schwenter, is quickly displacing ustedes. Now, if all that happens, clearly ustedes is going to disappear, and vosotros is going to acquire a new meaning. Just as you, which was formal in older English, ceased to be formal when thou disappeared. And so the gap between Spain and the New World will be pretty big. What about Britain? Well, in Britain we still have knights with a K. Knights who are addressed as Sir David, Sir John, or Sir Anthony. We have ladies who are addressed as Lady Jane or Lady Margaret. Mayors of towns and cities enjoy the title Lord Mayor. Members of Parliament address each other as Honourable Gentleman, Honourable Lady, Honourable Member for London South, if that's their constituency. Ministers are entitled to the more prestigious Right Honourable, Gentleman, Lady, or Member. Both honorifics, Honourable and Right Honourable, are often used with a degree of irony or sarcasm, especially when addressing a parliamentarian who has misbehaved, and that happens frequently in the British House of Commons. Psychopragmatic factors then do come into play, even in the Howard chambers of the English Parliament. Doctors who practice in British hospitals and are specialists insist on being addressed as Mr. or Miss, depending on their gender. They're not merely doctors or general practitioners. They're specialists, and they determine to signal their elevated status by rejecting the title doctor. Does this remind us of 17th century Europe? When overused, the value of an honorific or title is soon debased. Albeit less frequently, titles, honorifics, are of course also used in republics. We cannot entirely get away from them, nor can we easily avoid adjusting our behavior according to the identity and personality of our interlocutor. So let's conclude. Forms of address and reputation are just one area hardly given any attention when we teach history of the Spanish language. There are many others, I'll mention just three. First, the role of translation, particularly in the 12th and 13th centuries, when the syntax and lexis of Castilian undergo extraordinary elaboration. It's no exaggeration to say that Spaniards have engaged in corpus planning ever since their language was endowed with its own writing system, and translation played a significant role in this. Or the defense of the vulgar tongue, which started in Italy with Pietro Bembo in 1525, but spread like wildfire to France, Spain, and Portugal. Clearly, the battle between Latin and the vernacular continued to rage well into the 16th century and offers one of many opportunities to examine in detail the question of corpus planning and status planning. Third, Spain is and always has been multilingual, so there's always been a strong connection between language and power. We could therefore profitably look at centripetal and centrifugal forces at work, say, before, during, and after the military dictatorship of Francisco Franco, asking questions like, short of killing all its speakers, how can one exterminate a language? How can one protect one's language against extermination, or even against natural displacement? Some of you will be familiar with Ina Haugen's insightful observation: whenever two or more languages are in contact, they're in competition for users. What an intriguing topic this would be to explore with students. Finally, I invite us all to consider how we adjust our behaviour when we interact with others, and to ask ourselves whether we sometimes give in to psychopragmatic factors like anger or flattery. For instance, if an undergraduate student addresses by our Christian name, your first name, do we react like the Spanish Council of State? Are we so exercised by the breach in protocol that we pay no heed to the content of the communication? When it comes to a difference of opinion with another, do we dig in our heels like a Duke of Montalto, or do we try to work things out amicably? More particularly, do we good-naturedly accept the unwelcome decision of a superior? On the other hand, we're often told by our ecclesiastical leaders that we should not allow ourselves to be offended. We can, of course, strive not to be resentful or vindictive when others offend us. However, we are human and cannot avoid feeling the hurt that offences so often cause. So can 17th century Europe teach us something, anything, about the care we should use when we treat our neighbour? Thank you.